we suddenly become this great and powerful nation that is markedly more powerful than its near competitors, they will copy us, and that will then make them more powerful. It will be, if we manage to harness the tech revolution, it will work in exactly the same way that the Industrial Revolution worked. It will spread out, it will cascade wealth then across the world, improving the standard of living for literally everybody in the globe.
Georgian townhouses on the moon, the highest GDP per capita in the Milky Way. Small modular reactors under every village green. This is Anglofuturism.
Welcome back to the King Charles III Space Station. I'm Tom O.
And I'm Calum Drysdale. And Tom, where were you last night? You missed the pub quiz.
For a good reason. I was in Park Royal, northwest London, and I was at the opening of a new factory. As of last night, an Anglo-futurist is doing high-precision manufacturing in Zone 3. Congratulations to Alex Fitzgerald.
Highly Anglo-futurist conduct. We'll speak to Alex next week, but today we welcome another Tom, the essayist, counsellor, and ex-poster extraordinaire and think tanker, Tom Jones.
Tom blasted off this morning from RAF Wensleydale, a secret Anglo-futurist spaceport in North Yorkshire. He's now easing into one of the KC-3's Chesterfields. Tom, welcome to the show.
Ahoy, shipmates! How are we?
Very well. What are you drinking?
I'm actually drinking a straight down the line, like local plug. My mates run a brewery in Wensleydale, and they make this amazing beer called Black Dub, and it's a stout, and it's like black silk. So I thought that's what I really needed to get me through the day at 3 p.m. on a Friday.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that keg up. It's normally difficult to get it on a SpaceX transport.
Tom, we'll be chatting today about a paper you published last year about British immigration policy. We'll also be asking about automation and your vision of a pragmatic British industrial policy. But first, we'd like to ask you about a topic close to our hearts and yours, Anglofuturism.
Tom, you wrote a blog post about Anglofuturism some time ago now. How did you get into it?
I think I got into it in the same way that almost everybody did. So there was a lot of, it's an aesthetic, first of all, right? Until very recently, it has been Anglo-Anon posters on Twitter, just doing kind of lovely aesthetic AI-generated images of a Britain that, could be, that should be, that isn't. Following that, I got into it again through the same way as everybody else, which is the sacred text of Aris Rusinos.
And what about the Aris Rusinos essay attracted your interest?
I think it was a really interesting way of summarising that aesthetic. And I mean, the aesthetic is clear. So it's massively expanded cities, gentle density housing, historic architectural styles, skyscrapers, various forms of mass public transport, energy abundance. As well, one of the interesting things I think living in the countryside is it displays a complete mastery of and yet deep respect for the natural environment, whilst at the same time being quite unafraid of building big and building beautiful. So beautiful, folks. So I think basically what attracts everyone is it's a hope that another Britain is possible, one that's kind of restaked its claim to the future, whose pillars of accomplishment once again tower over the horizon. But I think it's also a kind of doom posting. It's like an artistic expression of a kind of future nostalgia. So, not mourning for a pristine past, which is the traditional kind of conservative thing, but for a future that never was.
Why do you think it was at that point that people were posting about it a lot, or at this point when there are mentions of it in magazines?
So I think Will Atkinson gave me this great line, which I am going to steal, which is that Anglofuturism is the last idea, right? I think...
And Will Atkinson is a Telegraph columnist, isn't he?
No, he's at Con Home, and he's a columnist at the Telegraph. Yeah. So I actually think it's innately tied up with the demographics of the people who are posting it, who are overwhelmingly young people, right? So I've got some stats here. Let's consider the average UK working age person, right? After 15 years plus now of wage stagnation, the poor side is 11 grand worse off than they should be. And their real incomes are predicted to continue dropping. They're facing the biggest fall in living standards on record. We've still not recovered from the COVID pandemic. That's without factoring in paying for the pensions conundrum. And it doesn't take into account the single biggest living expense, which is housing. And the average house price is now obviously 9 times earnings. And I think it's also tied up with the capacities of the state. So I think Duncan Robinson wrote in The Economist about the same time that this was all coming out that on average, somebody born in 1956 would have paid about 950 grand in tax in their life. But they stood to gain about 1.2 million. Whereas somebody born in about 1996 will enjoy less than half of that figure. And, you know, somebody who's about 27, on the cusp of 30 now, will receive barely more state support than somebody born in 1931. So that's a decade before the term welfare state had even been popularised. So I think it's a direct rejection of basically a very palpable decline, not just a stagnation, but a decline in living standards. And I think it's an appeal to a capable sovereign state that is there to protect people from systemic risks and that is effectively sovereign in the sense that it provides the average citizen some real, if limited, capacity to protect them from economic harms that are not their fault. Of course, obviously it isn't real, but who's to say we can't enjoy the euphoria of what might be?
Well, yeah, to me, it seems that although much of Anglofuturism is preoccupied with things like small modular reactors under every village green, as we like to imagine here, or a British space program, that kind of thing, perhaps the most fantastical element of it is this fantasy of a highly competent, highly agentic state. Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things I would pick up from Aris's essay, although, you know, obviously I don't want to disagree with the founder, is that I think Aris was slightly misplaced in his belief that the state can't do any of these things. I actually think that the state can do these things. Because he was saying it's time for us to hunker down and stop taking interest in the world outside Britain and to concentrate on cheap power and that kind of thing and cut our cloth according to our resources. I think that was the thrust. Yeah.
And I disagree with that slightly because we currently have the highest tax burden since the end of the war, and we have the highest level of public spending since the 1970s. And the fact is that we are basically, I think the problem is that we have a large state that does far too much instead of a small state that does less, but does that lesser role efficiently. So my argument is always, I don't think that, if I'm being honest, I don't think anybody really cares how much we spend on the border force, as long as it works. But I think that people do have an issue with how much we spend on the Arts Council, for instance. And I think we've got to go through a radical reprioritization of state spending.
And I think, there's a question here that a lot of people would say, is this not, you are yourself a Tory councillor, is this not the old reheated Tory idea, right? Slash it back, let people get on their own 2 feet. How is this different from, what some might uncharitably call reheated Thatcherism?
Well, what's wrong with reheating Thatcherism? It worked the first time.
Well, but I would say, is that not actually the problem that when Thatcher cut, and yes, you're right, was very effective, but in doing so, ran down the reserves that we had built up over sort of centuries, and that actually the problem was we were borrowing from the future, and now the time has come to pay, and that actually Anglofuturism needs to be separate and different from a sort of just cut approach.
Yes, I do think that is correct. I am not entirely uncritical of Margaret Thatcher, and I think where Anglofuturism needs to redirect itself is that it has a greater role, much greater role, for state capacity and for the state to do things and for an interventionist state. Our problem is at the minute is that we have a very interventionist state in some areas, in all the wrong areas, and a very light touch state in all the wrong areas. Again, we have, when it comes to crime, it feels like we have a very, very light touch state. When it comes to planning, we have a very, very heavy touch state. We have massive amounts of subsidies for the arts, and we have massive amounts of subsidies. Why do I keep going on about the arts? It's because they're not funding an Anglo-futurist art institute.
Well, there's some stuff that we fund within the arts that gets your goats, right?
Yeah, that's true. The best example is of the problems that the state face is actually in energy, right? So we have a really, really heavy state apparatus that prevents us from doing nuclear energy, but also doles out massive amounts of state support for renewable energies, right? And there is a dichotomy in that shows that actually all we really need to do is reprioritize the state, basically, and the state's goals. And I think that's where Anglofuturism is different to Thatcherism.
I think there's also, I mean, you talk about the Arts Council, and I think it's interesting that so much of this has been through images and not through words, that actually the Arts Council has been sort of a bureaucratic attempt to create more art. And I think many would argue that actually the result of it has been a reduction in the amount of sort of authentic and people-led or people-driven artistic work. And instead, we've got a sort of a bureaucratization of artistic production. And I think what Aris maybe, I mean, you maybe disagree, but what Aris' essay, I think, does well is it draws on this idea of the Irish Renaissance, or the Irish Revival, that there needs to be a return or a reclamation of the idea of a nation with its unique spirit producing values that are not just British values that are astroturfed on, but arise from the people and the mass and the gestalt that is uniquely English or British.
Yeah, I think that's completely right. I mean, if you look at how the Arts Council funds things, it is, I think, was it a gallery in Oxford recently, maybe last year, put up basically a sign next to some turners or some constables that said, watch out, because these pictures could make you become a nationalist because they're of the lovely, lovely countryside. And that is, which is insane. It's completely insane that we are paying for that. But we are actually, the Arts Council is incentivizing that through their payment structures, because they prioritize grants for basically people to diversify their audiences. People can't see that I put that in air quotes because it's nonsense.
I think we could hear it in your voice.
It's the sheer contempt. And I think, basically that is a kind of state-enforced artistic value now, And there is probably a part of Anglofuturism, the aesthetic, that is because of how it's come about, which is basically, lots of individual posters on X suddenly getting together and forming a mass movement completely on spec. That is a better representation of what Britons want than what the Arts Council is funding, despite the fact that taxpayers' money is being used to fund what the Arts Council is doing.
Yeah. And pick out for us, if you could, just one or two of those visual things that you've enjoyed from those posts that you refer to online. Like, tell us something that you like about Anglofuturism that isn't just like, fuck the Arts Council.
So I think probably the thing I would touch on the most is, I think, there's a real push towards making infrastructure beautiful, which is, we've not done that in this country for quite a long time, basically since probably the Victorians. And I think that shows that actually the people who are creating these images have a sense that infrastructure is innately valuable and should be valued, and therefore give it an aesthetic quality that we don't anymore. And I think that's really, really interesting. The idea of building like a neoclassical power station is very, very interesting. It shows you that these people, Anglofuturists, place such a high value on these things that they should be made beautiful because they are inherently valuable. They're not just utilitarian structures. They are the basis of a prosperous society.
Yes, I totally agree with that, and you can see that attitude in what's left of Roman infrastructure and the Victorian infrastructure that we still use. And I know that our listeners will be dying for us to ask this of you, Tom. What's the infrastructure situation like in Wensleydale, where you're a councillor?
Well, we've got a train station.
Okay. More than some can boast of.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, the infrastructure is as it is anywhere really rurally. Bus services are a problem, and we have potholes, and that's about it. But we're 15 minutes away from an East Coast mainline station. We're about an hour and a half away from Leeds Bradford Airport. So there are worse places in the country to live in terms of infrastructure, but it's not what it could be. There's no maglevs around here.
Is that not your fault, Tom? Is that not your job?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Come on, you're a councillor. You should be lobbying for the maglev.
This typical politician response, offloading the problem, not my problem.
Babies and opening supermarkets when you should be.
I've been a councillor for 3 years. How many maglevs do you think I should have built?
What? And we want to ask you about your paper, but before that, I would love to have an idea of what you do if not lobby for maglevs. What's a day in the life of Tom Jones, the councillor?
Well, I mean, it depends really. Being a councillor is kind of interesting because it's quite often dealing with the second order consequences of things that are beyond your power to change. So it's dealing a lot with, people who have problems with social care. It's dealing with, I'm going to say potholes because, basically we're never going to solve the roads crisis because even the Romans had pothole issues, right?
Aren't we going to spend all that HS2 money on filling potholes, every single pothole in the Midlands and the North? Yes,
we are.
Yeah,
I cannot, of course, comment on the decision of my MP, Rishi Sunak, to make that particular decision, but it is what it is. It's oftentimes dealing with things that you basically are beyond your power to change and just finding a way to make legislation work.
Tom, the reason that we're speaking to you is that you are not just an essayist and poster regarding Anglofuturism. You are a man of action. You are writing reports for think tanks, and
The most dynamic thing that one can do.
certainly more than me and Calum are doing. Just gassing away up in low Earth orbit. But we would like to ask you about this paper that you and a colleague put out last year. And I'm going to hand over to Calum to ask you a few questions about it.
Tom, this is the paper Selecting the Best that you wrote with David Cowan. Tell me a bit about the context that this paper is coming out in. Because I think the topic of immigration has been a heated one for a long time. That pre-Brexit, it was the big thing that people felt most strongly about, and numbers usually sat around 60% of the population thought that immigration levels were too high. Tell me what spurred the writing of this paper.
So I think what spurred it were some of the economic conditions that I've already described about the working age person. I think a lot of that, because I had been writing about immigration for a long time, I had started to understand that some of these were particularly related to immigration, and really the big spur was the Boriswave, which is the wave of immigration that happened after Boris Johnson became Prime Minister, Boris II, in 2019, which saw a massive wave of immigration. I say massive wave, literally historically unprecedented levels of immigration into the country. And I think that
from
really,
what to what?
It rose to, I think its highest figure is 1.2 million, which is just unbelievably high. It's completely unsustainably high, particularly when we're not building the infrastructure to cope with that, because we're not building the infrastructure to cope with like domestic population growth, if there is any. And I think the costs, the lowering of barriers on the Boriswave made a lot of people suddenly wake up to questioning the idea, which had previously been kind of was very, very mainstream, that immigration was actually good for the economy, and we kind of had to accept it because it was good for the economy. I think as the Boriswave brought down the barriers to entry, there was a much stronger questioning of that accepted wisdom, and that is really what spurred this paper.
And tell me about this lowering of standards, because I think a lot of people would say we need immigrants for the NHS, we need immigrants for the jobs that Britons don't necessarily want to do. Why do you say that standards were lowered?
Well, they were objectively lowered. The wages that you needed in order to come into the country were lowered by, I think, about £10,000. A lot of the qualifications were dropped, I think, from university level to A-level equivalent. So basically, standards were objectively lowered. I think the steelman case for the Boriswave is so Priti Patel is still putting this forward, is that we, as you said, we needed these jobs for the NHS, for social care. We had labour shortages in areas like trucking was the famous one, although that wasn't in the end solved by migration. Fruit pickers, things like this. It was, as you said, the jobs that people didn't want to do. There was suddenly a chronic labour shortage problem that needed to be solved, and the Boriswave was a way of doing that.
And I think maybe we can say as well that, from what I understand, the reason for this was inflation was a threat, and by bringing in a large number of people who are willing to work at pay levels below that of current British citizens, Boris was able to prevent wage increases and inflation, which would have then damaged him in the short term.
Yes, that's absolutely true. I think that was the driver behind the Boriswave, if I'm being honest. And I think Boris has been quite honest about that as well. There were certain financial incentives for businesses to hire abroad. Foreign labour could be hired at a cheaper rate. I think 20% discount in some areas. So obviously that had an effect on capping inflation.
I think
sorry, Tom, go on.
I think it's worth Chip. I don't know the extent to which this is part of the government thinking, but evidently there's a libertarian case for allowing people to come here if they want to and do jobs that they want to. Now, of course, you have to balance it. I don't want to come across as all woke, but that's part of it as well, right?
Yes, and that was innately tied up, I think, with the Singapore on Thames view of like post-Brexit Britain, was that we were going to take the brightest and the best, and then that kind of spiraled into what you're talking about at that point. Yes,
but it's not just taking the brightest and the best, right? It's giving people an opportunity to come here and work here. Like that is a good in itself. I think that's typically been part of the calculation around immigration.
Yeah, and I think that was also part of the calculation of this government. I would question their judgment in it, but yes, I think that is fundamentally part of it.
But the problem, Tom, and I think you lay this out in your paper, is that the aims of this large surge have not been met, and in fact, actually, it has been quite damaging.
Yes, in fact, I would push back slightly on that, because I think the aims have been carried out, right? Because the aims were almost specifically wage suppression, to which it has worked perfectly. And basically, the paper kind of spiraled out of an idea that I had called human quantitative easing, which is essentially that immigration for the last 20, 25, 30 years has acted essentially as Britain's industrial policy. It allows, it's the method by which government allows geographically rooted industries which cannot offshore their workforce to lower wage economies to satisfy their need for cheap labour by importing the same workforce to the UK, with government providing a subsidy where required in the form of services and welfare payments. And I think in terms of meeting the goals of deliberate wage suppression, it's worked perfectly. And that's the problem.
And I think the other point that it's also worth making is the number of dependents that came along with these people in both the health and social care visa, but also in other low-paid work. Do you want to talk a bit about that?
I think that is a phenomenon that has probably not has probably become measurably worse under the Boriswave. So we have seen an absolute surge in dependents. At one point, we were granting more visas to dependents of Nigerian students than Nigerian students, and we were granting an awful lot of visas to Nigerian students. And I think that's a unique characteristic about the Boriswave that again acted as a spur for this paper, as well as the increasingly low productivity of the people who were actually coming to do the work, because that has problems in the productivity cycle. Because whilst the migrants themselves might be as productive as native workers, that constant influx of cheap human capital disincentivizes investments, and that weak productivity results in flatlining wages, which cannot sustain the increasing demands on the welfare state. And then that has another arc to the circle, which is that faced with the choice between really difficult, really costly, long-term fixes to improve productivity, or a short-term fix to suppress increases in public spending and boost GDP figures, the government chooses the latter. It pulls the easiest lever, which is just more immigration. So GDP then is basically artificially boosted by an increase in population, whilst suppressing the cost of delivering public services by the insourcing of workforces from increasingly low-wage economies. Now, if you look at the pattern of incoming workers in Britain, that is historically what has happened. So the first wave of European immigration was from countries with very, very similar standards of living from Western Europe. It was then expanded out into Central Europe and increasingly lower wage European economies through the EU expansion. And now under the Boriswave, you are seeing increasing amounts of, I think we actually have net emigration to the EU now. But now you see a lot more immigration from places like Nigeria, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, and India. And a system that kind of exploits cheap labour kind of depends on a continuing influx of immigrants, because it's a way of instituting a regime of permanent competition, not so much between natives and immigrants, but amongst immigrants themselves, in order to prevent any rises in the total wage bill.
Well, and you talk about Britain as a low wage economy, which I think many people, who are used to these images of, who work in, say, high productivity sectors, such as in tech or in finance, might find surprising. Do you want to talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, I think, the comparison with America is always going to haunt us, right? Because there are some people, and I'm tempted to believe it, that America just has the mandate of heaven, because every time every time there's a new technology that needs a massive amount of natural resources, right? Some farmer in bumfuck Idaho finds the most massive natural deposit enough to last 1 million years in continental America. So, but if you compare us to the US, if we were a US state, we would be the poorest US state GDP per capita. We would be poorer than, when you think of America, you think of the vast wealth of places like California, New York, financial centers, film centers, whatever. We would be poorer than places that we would consider as Britons, much poorer than our own. Places like Mississippi would be significantly wealthier than ours. And I think the problem is with wage economies is that obviously we don't know explicitly the British counterfactual. What would have happened had we not had this immigration surge? But in some ways we do. So looking at the one of the great labour shortages of post-Brexit Britain was in trucking. This is hauliers, right? And I use this example in the paper. That was solved not by immigration, because it was a European-wide shortage of hauliers. I'm not quite sure I can remember why there was a European-wide surge, but it was solved basically through government slashing red tape to get people into the industry, government and private sector incentivizing people to get into the industry in terms of offering loans for training, and massive wage increases. So just in that little example, we can see a vision of Britain, of the Britain we could have had, which I think would have seen very, very, very sustained wage rises.
Well, and it's one in which the average Briton then sees their wages increase, right, in response to scarcity. That actually, and their life starts improving because they're not having to compete with people. And I think it's something quite perverse about it, that we're asking British people to compete with those coming from, the slums of Lagos, who are willing to exist at a level of sort of subsistence that we would find intolerable. And yet we accept that as this sort of existence of a slave caste as just an inevitable and required part of being a Western country.
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit like the kind of the way the Spartan state was constructed, right? Like, we have glorious Spartan warriors, and then we have this just completely hellatized like slave class who do all the jobs, and then there was that like middle class perioikoi, something like that. No, that's not right. Who would do like the semi-skilled labor of like pottery and things like that. But Spartans didn't actually get their hands dirty doing like economic activity.
What class were the podcasters in?
Definitely the bottom class. Definitely the bottom class. We're on par with actors in Rome, sort of to be spat on.
That in particular, you can see that in housing. So one of the reasons the housing crisis in London and the South East is so acute is because that is where most incoming migrants agglomerate. And because they are prepared to have such a lower standard of living, if you are let's say, slightly less than reputable landlord, you can have, one, guy in zone 5 or zone 3 renting your room for, let's say, £1,000 a month, right? Or you can sublet that single room 5 times and have 5 people pay you £400 a month. You make vastly more on that, and then so there is so that's I mean, that's a great example, and of course another way it's slightly it's perverse is that it completely disincentivizes native training. So we do not spend anywhere near enough on training of native workers, because from the point of view of businesses and to a certain extent of government, it's actually quite a lot more difficult to train up people, to train up native workers who would demand native wages, when you can just pull the lever marked immigration, more HQE please, we need these people, we need to pay them 20% less than the going market rate. That's the easiest and most profitable short-term thing for government and businesses to do, and that's why they keep doing it. It's very, very, very short-termist, and it's very perverse, but it does keep happening.
Well, and then, we see it, as you say, in car washes, don't we? That when once it used to be common to have automated car washes, and now they are shuttered, and instead you have three blokes with high pressure water guns, right?
Yeah. So actually, I car washes is I included car washes in the paper because it's such an easy to grasp, visible example of HQE. So I've got some stats here. Did you, when you started this podcast, right, did you think that you would have some guy giving you stats about car washes at some point further down the line? Or did you genuinely think you were going to talk about space?
I think, Tom, we sort of hoped that what would happen is we'd put out 3 episodes, there'd be regime change, and we'd be elevated to sort of philosopher king status.
Yeah,
I'm sure this is the episode that will bring that about.
This is the last piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
So in a couple of years ago, hand car washes were 90% of the market, which was up from 80% a couple of years before that. And they have almost entirely now killed off automated car washes. So in 2000, there were 9,000 automated car washes in this country. 2018, which was the last figure I could find, there were 2,000. And I cannot possibly imagine that number would have gone up. And that has been driven by a surge of migrant labour so cheap it drove out automated car washes almost overnight. And that, to be honest, that's what the UK Car Wash Association actually says. I think the director of strategy, I'm looking at the quote now, said, with the accession of new Eastern European states to the EU, we had a big influx of immigration, and that's when the proliferation of unregulated hand car washes began. Almost overnight, they constituted 85% of the car wash locations in this country. Now, that has been exacerbated because, as I said, of the patterns of migration that we've seen coming into the country. Not only have the wages of the workers got lower, but their standards of acceptable standards of work have got lower. So they are beset now by exploitation and slavery. And I found some research that shows that more than 90% of hand car washes are likely to be employing workers illegally, without proper pay, without proper records, without PPE, or without any first aid measures. Now, you know, if you've completely obliterated your industry like that, you've also completely obliterated your tax base, as well as any industry you might have had producing those those automated car washes in the first place. So it's a great, really visible example of HQE in action, where a higher productivity technological solution has lost out to a low wage, low productivity competitor that relies on low wages and exploitation.
And I think this is the Anglofuturist problem, right? Because we want robot butlers. We don't want to imagine an Anglofuturist future where instead of having a fully automated breakfast setup, instead you have 30, very poorly paid, enslaved people coming and waiting on you hand and foot. It's not quite the same vibe, is it?
That's a rickshaw or a maglev.
Yeah.
Exactly. Pulling the maglev behind them as they run along the tracks.
There is an argument, I'm going to steal man. There is an argument that I've seen put forward, I think, by the think tank, the Institute of Economic Affairs, which is that actually it's not really a problem because you are making the average person more productive by outsourcing those jobs to lower productivity places, right? But the problem in this case is that you have debased a high productivity technological solution and the entire industry and got slave labour instead.
Well, and I think also, as you said, the problem is that the government is in many ways subsidising this. So this is not a state that is emerging naturally from the economic realities of the time. Instead, the supplying of subsidies in the form of benefits and subsidised housing to recent migrants is a form of subsidy for this, as you called it, this industrial strategy, right?
Yeah. I mean, in the case of the car washes, you also have the downstream problems that, because they are illegally run, they basically have no concern for any environmental standards. So you also have the downstream costs that the state has to absorb of, suddenly you've got these really harmful, like alloy cleaning chemicals just going into a drain, and at some point that has to be cleaned, and that is a massive cost. But you're right, because you are allowing so many people in, and as well the scale of dependence that we have allowed in now under the Boriswave, we are having to provide more and more amounts of subsidies, and the cost benefit analysis is just getting worse and worse all the time.
Yeah, I mean, there's the research from the Centre for Migration Control that says that the dependents who've entered the country just since 2021 will cost taxpayers, 35 billion by 2028. I mean, this is in many ways, I think, a pyramid scheme, right? Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah. I mean, 35 billion is an insane figure, and I think I said this.
How many Chagos Islands is that?
Yeah. that means that is money that you cannot spend elsewhere.
Yeah, I think it's worth reminding listeners that HS2 is supposed to cost 90 billion. That was too much. This is 35 billion.
How much would you like to spend per year on your space program?
I'm afraid that the figure would bankrupt the country.
I think the number was 400 billion, wasn't it, for BTEC?
Well, I don't know what our GDP is, but it's that precise number.
But that's a tenth. If you want to spend 400 billion, you're spending nearly 40 billion. You've got almost 10% of your space budget going on support for dependents, most of whom are economically inactive. And where they are economically active, you are seeing huge amounts of remittances going back to the nations of origin rather than being spent in the economy.
Tom, you've described some pretty big taxpayer liabilities generated by the people arriving as part of the Boriswave. Can we do Anglofuturism with those liabilities?
No, I don't see that you can, to be quite honest, because the amount of state spending that we are giving in to solve like first order consequences of human quantitative easing, I think you've just said it's 35 billion, right? That's in immediate payments in like welfare, housing, things like that. And then you have the amount of which remains uncalculated of like second order spending. So, you know, how much more money in the case of the car washes, how much more money do you need to spend suddenly like sorting out your waterways and purifying the water that's being put in, getting rid of these alloy chemicals, right? And then you have things like how much more do you need to spend on just upgrading the existing infrastructure that you've got? How much do you need to spend on policing? It has a cascading effect of spending that I think just makes the massive amounts of spending that you would need on Anglofuturism just unviable.
And then for the benefit of listeners who do not peruse every new policy paper on immigration, perhaps you could remind them of the measures that you proposed at the end of yours.
So, I mean, we proposed kind of a whole range of solutions on this. Annual caps on visa routes, which would be informed by annual migration budgets that would have to be approved by Parliament, informed by a migration book. That's, to be honest, that was something that was proposed earlier by Carl Williams at the Centre for Policy Studies in a paper with Rob Jenrick and Neil O'Brien. We thought it was a really sensible way to approach a much more informed, to get a much more informed, information-led, data-led way to approach your migration policy. We would set an overall skilled worker cap somewhere of around 50 to 60,000, abolish the graduate visa route, retire the shortage occupation list, cap the number of health and social care visas, extremely limited round of work visas for very desirable immigration schemes. So that is actually us incentivizing certain areas of immigration. So in areas, for instance, like nuclear welders, where we don't really have at the minute the training capacity to get the workforce we need. We are not saying, you know, absolutely no migration anywhere at all, but that it needs to be incredibly selective. We would.
I mean, I think this is you maybe hit on a point here, right? A lot of people think of migration as purely down at that lower end. I mean, if we can find nuclear welders, we should be poaching them left, right, and centre, right?
Well, I mean, maybe not, because we've got no work for them.
No, friend of the show, Lawrence Newport, is trying to fix that.
But yeah, like, you know, maybe bankers would be a great example. Do I want to put my name to a pro-banking immigration policy? Maybe. I don't know. One of the big ones, I think, would be to create a new guest worker program for seasonal work that has no pathway to residency, no pathway to citizenship, and no access to welfare state whatsoever. Other than, you know, like, oh, I've sliced off my hand. Obviously, we're going to say no there.
Tom Jones, the great humanitarian.
I am a benevolent god. What else would we do? We would. One of the big things is the. You know, we're often told that the NHS absolutely needs these workers. The NHS workforce plan states specifically that the NHS does not want to be reliant on foreign workers because it's incredibly unstable. I think they also, behind the scenes, have increasing concerns about the quality of medical practitioners that we have been taking in.
Well, I mean, there's the stat that doctors trained abroad have 3 times higher disciplinary proceedings and sort of upheld disciplinary proceedings against them, right? That in many cases the training is not up to scratch with British standards.
No, it's simply not. It's simply not, and I think it's 3 times on average, but it changes significantly. So South African doctors are less likely than British. I think they're the only group that's less likely, but Pakistani doctors are 11 times more likely to be reported.
Well, and that's partly because there's a culture, right, of fraudulent sort of visa mills and diploma mills, right?
Yes, yeah. I think there was a case. I wrote about this earlier. There was a man who just printed off a fake doctorate from the University of Auckland, and then went to go and work as a psychiatrist, I think, in the NHS, and has earned £1 million in his time at the NHS on a completely fake degree. So one of the things we would do to counter that and to get the NHS hooked off imported workforces would be to scrap the cap on the number of medical training places available. Enable more...
Which is astonishing. Unbelievable.
It's one of the most insane policy decisions I've ever heard. And it was made...
Yeah, describe it on behalf of the listeners, please.
So the Steelman case for this was that doctors were...
So there's a limit on the number of doctors that could be trained per year.
Yeah, basically...
The British paid places. So there's no limit on foreign places.
Right.
And that was done because the medical profession was concerned about training capacity and training standards, and they basically didn't want there to be a lowering of standards in order to enable just like mass qualifications. The problem is that we are now turning away, like, I think is it last year was like 75% of qualified applicants were denied a place at medical training schools. So we have the supply of new doctors and NHS staff, and we have the demand, but we have this completely artificial barrier to meeting demand with supply. And instead, we're just getting people from abroad with much worse medical qualifications, much worse standards. So we would completely get rid of that. We would re-establish the resident labour market test for medical practitioners, which means that jobs would have to be offered to British doctors first. We would abolish all state-sponsored immigration schemes, including like the Department for Education will give foreign teaching recruits a £10,000 international relocation payment, but gives native workers nothing. And also allows the people on the qualified teacher scheme to be paid significantly less if they're from abroad than domestically. We took quite a lot from the trucking example, so offering part-time courses, offering more grants to areas where there are labour shortages. We'd remove the social care visa gradually to give time for the market to adjust. That should raise wages and stop it being a backdoor. And one of the big things is raising the salary threshold for all immigration to £40,000 per annum, and then tie it to inflation. So one of the problems is that we lowered the salary threshold to 24,000, which is far, far, far below the break-even rate for the Exchequer. And basically our argument on this is that if we are going to have a selective immigration system, we need to select people who are contributors to the Exchequer. So we set it at a level at which the average migrant will be a contributor and then continues to be a contributor. And then we did quite a lot of stuff on sporting automation.
Tom, your immigration paper is clearly written with what you consider to be the interest of the British people at heart. Is there anything in it that might benefit foreign workers or people abroad? Like, how do you weight these other interests? Do you see them as competing?
Yeah, we do have things for foreign workers. So one of the things we suggested was allowing anybody employed in the same company for 5 years to apply for indefinite leave to remain, but then make further steps in the citizenship process kind of contingent upon assessments. We also had quite a lot of things about offering automatic citizenship to people who employed a certain number of people in Britain. That's to attract basically entrepreneurs, people who want to found companies or bring companies here. So yeah, but I think our incentive structure is much more geared towards the kind of top level of immigration, to those kind of the brightest and the best as they actually are, rather than as described by perhaps Priti Patel.
Yes, the absolute best floor sweeper in Karachi.
Isn't there an argument to be made, though, that if we convert our economy from a low-wage economy with a low GDP per capita to a high-wage economy with a higher GDP per capita, we are in fact better placed to help people abroad? Like, that's one of the good things that you can do if you are a rich country. You can actually help people who otherwise you might be importing to little effect.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really, really, really strong argument. When Britain was at its, but I think I said this in my call with you, Tom. Like
when we last spoke,
yeah, we should make Britain so rich and so powerful that we can ban slavery again, right? Like, that's the ultimate goal. We are not going to solve the world's problems by bringing the world's problems here. And there is an extenuating problem, which is the remittances problem. So there's quite conclusive research now that shows that the more middle class a country becomes, the higher the rate of emigration from that country, because you are basically you're creating a new middle class with the amount of remittances that are then able to emigrate from that country. So you are actually exacerbating a lot of these problems, not to mention the pre-existing brain drain that you are instituting in these countries. Is it right morally, from a utilitarian perspective, is it right morally that we rob Nigeria of their doctors once they're trained?
Well, we might disagree. I'd be totally happy with that as long as they paid it.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's that argument, but I don't think that's good for Britain. Is it good for global welfare? This paper is not written with global welfare in mind, but it is certainly something that you need to take into account when you are doing these things. And the best thing for global welfare, frankly, is not to brain drain countries.
Listeners, I think that's as good a point as any for us to go to a break, and we'll be back after a brief word from our sponsors.
When you're in founder mode, you can always use an extra hand to help out. The problem, however, is that hand usually comes attached to a human who wants wages and time off. Well, our friends at Nimue Biologics have developed the first fully autonomous biological personal assistant, the helping hand. This little miracle can take notes, keep your diary, and cook any meal you like, as long as it doesn't require moving the pan at the same time as a spatula. Nimue hands are also incredibly easy to keep and make loyal companions. They have few needs beyond an occasional nail trimming. They can be good around children, though, and this is important, Nimue recommends keeping the hand away from babies, as it can be a choking hazard. I mean, it is literally a disembodied hand, so use common sense there. Oh, and I should mention, keep your helping hand away from any large body of water. Apparently, they have a tendency to indulge in histrionics with scimitars. Of course, if you are interested in this feature, Nimue does offer the premium Excalibur package, perfect for the ambitious CEO who just needs a helping hand to build the future. Reach out to the Nimue Biologics sales team today and mention code FOUNDERGRIND for 20% off your first helping hand. Because who needs work-life balance when you can have a severed hand doing your bidding?
Welcome back, listeners. We remain in the King Charles III space station with Tom Jones. And Tom, we've been talking about your immigration reports, of which one interesting element to us was this emphasis on automation. Tell us why automation was such an important part of that document.
Well, I think basically because of the way that HQE functions as an industrial strategy.
And that's human quantitative easing, just a reminder to listeners.
Yeah, human quantitative easing. Because of the way it has hooked our industry and our economy on kind of cheap human capital, the productivity of our private sector has stalled. And I think, and a lot of the research shows that is down to a persistent failure to create the environment for long-term investments in capital, in infrastructure, in skills, and in innovation. So, you know, I remember writing a piece, I think, for The Critic a long time ago, that in 2022, China installed 250,000 industrial robots, and the UK installed just over 2,500. You know, R&D spending systematically fails to hit the target, which is 2.4% of GDP, significantly behind the OECD average, well below nations like Germany, Japan, Israel. You know, those are nations that really we should be competing with.
Should be outperforming.
Yeah, we should be beating. Yeah. And you know, there was another report that found no evidence to show that government skills reforms have had a direct or positive impact on UK productivity over the last 2 decades, because why would it, when you have a huge influx of much cheaper labour from abroad? And that's only in the private sector, right? In the public sector, things are even worse, because productivity, I think, has grown by 0.2% between 97 and 2019, and it's got worse since then. Now, obviously, we didn't use the COVID stats because COVID significantly affected productivity, but I believe it's still kind of mid-2000s level.
And as you say, Tom, abroad the Chinese are developing these industrial robots. And I think at heart what you're saying is that automation is enabling Sinofuturism, yet our economic model means that we are sort of stuck in this Anglo-present, right? Like to get to your kind of national futurism, you need a level of automation.
Yes, yeah, that is exactly right. So the Chinese automation strategy goes hand in hand with their immigration strategy, which is just to not have any immigration. And they are, you know, they face broadly now similar kind of demographic challenges that we do, because declining birth rates are not a national, they're a global phenomenon. And the way that China is seeking to solve that is basically just to automate their economy. And ultimately, there will be a lot more Chinese people, as there will be a lot more British people working in the social care sector to care for an aging economy. But they have chosen to basically free up that workforce via automation rather than importing workforces from abroad to undercut wages.
I was just going to say, it's a sort of useful to remember almost that productivity is output per hour, right? That robots allow individual workers to achieve a whole lot more than they would without the tools. You know, a robot is like a drill that allows you to screw in a screw or hammer in a nail faster. These are labor empowering tools, and by passing these up, we're sort of stuck or choosing to remain in not even an Anglo present, but an Anglo past.
Yeah.
Yeah, it seems like it's not a contest between the robot jobs and the human jobs, right? Like if we have a more productive economy, that gives us more money to support other kinds of labor and other contributions.
I mean, that's the ideal, but as in the example of the car wash, like you are right, Callum. Like in the example of the car wash, we have basically taken a technological step backwards because of the way we've employed HQE, and I think there are a lot of there is a competition between robots and humans, but the competition is between immigrant workforces and robots, rather than between native workforces and robots, if that makes sense.
But it's not just that, right? Like it's a little more complex than that.
Yeah.
And we should talk about the United States, because demographically they're much more similar to us than the Chinese are. And yes, my impression is that the US is far ahead of us on automation. Could you explain that gulf a little bit, please?
Yeah, I think that's probably the result of more far-sighted US policy than it is here,
or just less short-sighted policy.
Sorry, less short-sighted. Yeah, that is much better. I think because the US is so concerned about competition with China, because it considers it a peer power, and considers it a peer economic rival. They can see what China's doing and are actually reacting to it, whereas because we don't, we're just looking at Europe and what Europe is doing. We're kind of copying them, who are governed by the regulatory state of the EU, where therefore, with the energy prices that we're all facing, particularly in England, like robotics isn't really an option. There are a confluence of factors with the robotics, but like it's not just immigration there, it's also that it is also planning laws to get these things installed, and it's energy to make it affordable to run those robotics as an alternative to employing immigrant workforces.
I think one of the tragic elements of this situation regarding our incredibly expensive energy is that we don't have a direct visual comparison with the country that we could be living in if we had cheap energy. It's very difficult to really comprehend how different our country could be, but maybe one way into this is thinking about industries that would look different if we had cheaper energy. So my question, Tom, in short, is what should we be automating that we don't currently?
Well, my one really, really big thing with automation is, have you ever been to Decathlon?
Is that the cycling shop?
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. Because I have like early onset middle age.
You're a big cyclist, right?
Yeah. I'm already doing triathlons.
He's actually wearing Lycra in the pub right now.
It's very revealing, isn't it? So, like, Decathlon have these amazing tills where you drop your basket in, and in a flash, every single item, it is never failed. Every single item is put straight onto your shopping list, and all you have to do. This is
going to be quite revealing, but I know about this because of Uniqlo.
Do Uniqlo have that as well? I don't shop there because I'm not cool.
I bought a lot of clothes in my 20s from Uniqlo.
But like, that is a great example of a job that should just be automated, right? McDonald's, I don't think I've ever eaten McDonald's, but I understand they have like completely automated ordering systems now.
Wait, sorry, you've never eaten a McDonald's?
Not as an adult, no.
Do they not have them in Wensleydale, or do you have an ideological opposition to it?
I have an ideological opposition to it. Yeah. So
which element?
It's a seed oils thing.
It's a seed oils thing.
Yeah, it's a seed oils thing.
Right.
Yeah. I basically eat chicken and eggs and not a great deal else, and yet still somehow I'm massively overweight.
10 episodes into our podcast, and I'm afraid the bro podcast Godwin's Law thing has kicked in, whereby someone has finally uttered the phrase seed oils. We're going to have to stop. But in the name of Ray Peat, we'll plow on. I mean, let's just sit back and think for a minute of like the other things that we could automate.
So I think a big area of this is transport. I think you could automate a lot of transport jobs away. You could also automate train drivers pretty easily, I think. Taxis.
They'd have to have an extra functionality whereby if a child was standing on a railway bridge though and sort of pumped their arm, that the train would still have to honk. That would be my sort of hard line in the sand.
Yes, there will still be room for humanity. Yeah,
the maglev will honk.
You could automate taxis as well, for instance.
Well, I mean, they already are, right? That's the thing. That's again is our regulation. Well, although Waymo here is doing rather well, but why are we not the first to have the automated taxis?
Wait, can you get a Waymo in London now?
Is it a Waymo or is it a Wave?
I wasn't aware of any automated taxis in London.
There's a company that's raised a lot of money doing it in Britain.
But like I've ridden in Waymos in San Francisco, and it's very spooky and spectral to sit in the passenger seat and then see the wheel to start turning as the car drives off. But unfortunately, one downside of this marvelous technology is that sometimes just people just start kicking the shit out of it, and it's just a meek robot. That's so it can't like shout at them.
You need to have a robot sitting there in the passenger seat that can look over its shoulder and tell you to cut it out. You know what? You have to follow all the forms so that people realize that there is still someone there who can look at them and tell them that they're being a prat when you throw up into your jumper, or
some gammony taxi driver who turns around and says he doesn't like immigrants, which is rather familiar sensation on this podcast, Tom.
Fucking robots coming over here taking our jobs.
Yeah.
But yeah, the possibilities are endless. Factory robots, taxis.
Well, this is what I'm doing. I'm doing at the moment in my PhD is I'm trying to automate myself out of having to do any pipetting. Is that I'm building a robot that can, as a biochemist or doing biochemistry, I have to move tiny volumes of liquid around. And instead, I'm building a robot to do it instead, so I can go down to the pub at 3:00.
Amazing.
Tom, you also write that the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology should introduce a new annual award for recognizing advancement in automation and robotics. And you additionally say there should be a Royal Robotics Society. Tell us a bit more about these institutions that you're conjuring up.
Yeah, so this is really about raising the, not just raising the importance, but raising the status of robotics. So if Britain wants to be a world leader, I think the state, and again, this speaks to the bigger role of state that Anglofuturism has, right? You need to build the kind of state frameworks for these technological changes to take place. One of my friends has described one of Britain's problems as the fact that there's no regulatory air at the very cutting edge of technology. So you basically need something like a Royal Robotics Society to be at the very cutting edge of technology, kind of advising government to say, well, we're having a problem in this department because the legislation is not allowing us to do this, or we're facing a mass problem with installing robots in this sector because of this particular bit of planning legislation that needs to be changed. So you basically create the kind of institutional framework, but also the prize is very much that took a lot from Germany, where obviously they celebrate their engineers a lot more than we do. It has a much higher status. David Goodhart has written quite a lot of this about the three H's: the work done with the head, the heart, and the hands. And Britain only values the value that's done with the head, and the Germans also value the work that is done with the hands in kind of terms of engineering and things like that. And in order to kind of incentivize robotics as a good career and something that Britain should be investing in, we should be celebrating the basically the biggest advances and the best British people.
Well, if it became known that you could get a knighthood for doing robotics, then given the number of people who go into the civil service and work for absolutely nothing in the hope of getting a gong, we could pour the vast numbers of graduates towards the distant hope of becoming knight commander of the differential engine or some other chivalric order.
I'm really not sure I want to advocate for a robotic civil service fast stream, to be honest, given how good the last fast stream has been.
Okay, we need to counter signal, so no one should go and do robotics in the government.
Will the robots engage the stakeholders? Will they be able to see the big picture and deliver at pace?
It will be a core prime directive. Jones's 4 laws of robotics. Tom, you said earlier that the goal of this is to once again be a nation strong enough or powerful enough to be able to do the equivalent of banning slavery. And I think by that you mean be wealthy enough that we don't need to spend our time worrying about this kind of thing and can instead be a force for good or an active force in the world beyond just these sort of, I would say, technocratic questions. What sort of Britain do you think could emerge, or would you like to see that emerges sort of 10 years down the line from these kind of changes?
I think a Britain, if I could sum it up in one word, that finds practicalities almost shameful to notice. I think ultimately Anglofuturism is going to require a state that does a lot less, but performs that more limited role more carefully. Again, we're not just talking about a bonfire of the Quangos here. We're talking about a really radical reprioritization of the state's responsibilities. And we need to redirect the state's efforts rather than kind of constrain them. I think Aris wrote that, in his piece, we have to have like a wartime level of mobilization focused on state resilience. And the problem at the minute is that, if you call back to the kind of Sino-futurism vision, right, that's what China has. Whereas in Britain, we were talking about equipping our political class with a literal army of teenagers via national service, and all they could conceive of doing with them was like community volunteering. And I think that's I think Westminster is increasingly ignorant of the pressures of an increasingly unstable world. And I think one of the problems is it remains focused primarily on questions of redistribution, right? So we see a huge conveyor belt of huge government programs to address societal ills, like the fucking state-backed toothbrushing program, right? We have a politics that is still concerned with redistributing the spoils of the victors rather than creating an economy that raises the standard of living for everyone. And redistributive approaches are well and good when there is enough to redistribute, but there isn't anymore. The problem with the Blairite consensus is that eventually you run out of other people's money. So I think in the future we will need to reprioritize towards national resilience, and that's the Anglo part of the project, right? An active agenda that is prepared to take difficult decisions to ensure citizens' living standards are protected and improved. And then the futurism part is, that's the glorious infrastructure that is built now to secure lives and prosperity and wealth of our descendants right across the board, the standard of living for everyone.
What I'm hearing from you, Tom, is that if you had an army of teenagers at your disposal, you wouldn't waste them on community service, but instead they'd be in the drone motor winding factories with their nimble little fingers.
They would be working the pumps so that we can raise Doggerland.
That's what we like to hear. Or we'd be sending them to Antarctica, right, to defend our claim as well.
Yeah. Like manning the helium-3 mines on the moon.
Tom, you've drunk the bar dry, and we are soon to let you fly back down to Wensleydale. But before we do, I want to go back to something you said earlier, which is that our aim as a country should be getting powerful enough once again to do the equivalent of banning slavery. So and what you are saying is that in your vision of a high level of automation, a reformed immigration system, we might enact some level of Anglofuturism, and that would enable us to do serious good in the wider world. But what could that serious good be?
Banning space slavery.
Banning space slavery, right?
No, I think one of the interesting things about politics at the minute, and Anglofuturism sits against this, is that not just in Britain, but I think across the West, there is a kind of intellectual stagnation. I think that's changed a little bit with Trump in America. I think you are starting to see the visions of a very different, more future-focused right-wing movement that is less about looking to the past and more towards the future. It's more ambitious. But in other countries, particularly Britain, I think you've seen an intellectual stagnation, a kind of a lack of national ambition from politicians who are limited, willingly or unwillingly, by the poverty of our existing political model and our existing thought, right? And I think if we manage to carry out Anglofuturism, essentially we will lift all boats with us, right? If we suddenly become this great and powerful nation that is markedly more powerful than its near competitors, they will copy us, and that will then make them more powerful. It will be, if we manage to harness the tech revolution, it will work in exactly the same way that the Industrial Revolution worked. It will spread out, it will cascade wealth then across the world improving the standard of living for literally everybody in the globe.
Well, and perhaps accompanied by our own values rather than, say, the CCP's values.
Yes, exactly. Particularly in the realms of AI, right? Like you want British people writing that code, not like state apparatchiks.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I think that's where that is Anglofuturism's great potential contribution to global welfare. But ultimately, it does need to be Anglofuturism, because we are living in an increasingly unstable world, and as I said earlier, we cannot possibly hope to solve all of the world's problems, and it needs to be about solving our crippling problems first, and then hoping that the rest of the world follows us.
In the case of an emergency, tend to your own mask before helping any others. Tom, thank you very much for joining us up here in low Earth orbit. We will include links to your paper and your Substack in the show notes. Where else do you write, and where can people read more of your work?
The best place to find me is on Twitter, where I am at 93 Vintage Jones, and follow my Substack, The Potemkin Village Idiot.
Wonderful. Well, as Tom levers himself athletically and lycrally or slinkily into the Soyuz capsule.
I'm 6'5".
As he crams himself into the Soyuz capsule.
Which is enormous frame into the module. Rest assured that it is automatically piloted. He's not drinking it in the
productivity in this bar rises significantly with his departure. We say thank you. That's all from us. Goodbye.
Thank you, Tom.
Bye.
Thanks, listeners. Goodbye.
Cheers, guys.